I just wanted to mention that how I met Dean at MIT. You were actually at Facebook before, and you had just moved from. I think we may have even gone to the same orientation.
I believe so. Yeah, I think we were starting at the same time. Yeah,
and we were, so Dean had been at Facebook and working with the data science team. I think it's called the data science team, right?
Yeah, I mean now they call it a core data science team because there's so many data scientists everywhere. So
and he was working on all these really cool projects, and he was one of those annoying people who had access to all the data. Right? You know what I mean, right? Like, and somehow he left that and moved to MIT. Probably paid him best, but that's something to admire in that he likes. He's motivated by wanting to do more science, and maybe he can have intellectual freedom and keep doing teaching and engagement with graduate students. But I remember in the orientation at MIT for new faculty, there was this session about the Imposter Syndrome. I think that was the title. I remember this. And then, they were talking, and basically the message was, you probably all feel like you don't belong here, but it's okay. It's a common feeling, and don't worry about it. You all actually belong here. You're here. Of course you feel it. You feel it, right? Because you feel like this is one of the most eminent places. And in my mind, I was thinking, it probably doesn't. So which is another way of saying that I admire Dean, and I think he's very competent, and he's one of the few people who I think is extremely good at the conceptual idea level, but also at the methodology, right? And you have lots of people who are really good at methodology, lots of people who are good at conceptual ideas, and few people who can combine both. So this is one of the reasons why I admired him, and so really happy that he's spending his sabbatical here in Berlin. So see more of him. Perhaps, but
cool. You're too kind.
Agatha, you want to do the kind of explain the format and how you'll moderate the Q&A, and please go ahead.
Very simple. It's around 40 minutes for you for presentation. It depends on you if you prefer to take also questions, like short questions in the meantime.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'm happy to take questions throughout. Yeah.
Great. So after that, we also have like 15 minutes for more extended discussion, and that's basically it about today. And of course, if you want to talk with us later, we spend more time here, and there's also dinner on Thursday.
Yeah, awesome.
Whoever wants to join, it's Thursday around 7. Yeah, so doing more formal thing. So as I read in the webpage, you introduce yourself as social scientist and statistician, working in Mitsubishi Career Development, associate professor in the Sloan School of Management, and affiliated faculty at the Institute for Data Systems Society in the Schwarzman College of Computing, or MIT. You had impressive educational track at Stanford, obtaining several degrees in symbolic systems, philosophy, statistics, and ultimately PhD in communications. And building on that background, this work revolved around communication technologies and how they shape human behavior. And to that end, Dean draws inspiration tools and methods from diverse disciplines such as complex networks, social interactions, contagion, and causal inference, while fitting them appropriately to various experiential designs. And of course, it's worth to mention your research experience in giants like Nokia, Yahoo, and Facebook. And I believe one of the parts of the presentation will be about Facebook data. And without further ado, we'll forward to the presentation on long time information, social contagion, and economic outcomes. So the floor is yours.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to interacting with people more. So yeah, I'm going to be in Berlin until basically the end of November, and I don't have anything in particular to do here. When I found out, that I was getting tenure and then I got a sabbatical, my wife and I talked about what we should do with the sabbatical, and she's like, "Why don't we go to Berlin?" I really liked it, and I said, "Well, I've never been to Berlin. In fact, I'd actually never spent a night in Germany at all, but I said, yeah, why not? Let's, I trust you. You say I'll like it. So anyway, so we're here. So it'd be great to connect. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of, there's two papers here, basically. One, and this can be a little bit choose your own adventure, depending on how much interest there is in the first part and how deep we go into that versus the second part. So the first part is with some Facebook data. So actually for a while after I went to MIT, I was doing a little bit of stuff wrapping up things with Facebook data, and then kind of started trying to do other things. Part of the reason to leave Facebook was to not just do Facebook all the time. But then it kind of turned out that for a project that my student Iman Jahani and I were exploring, that it seemed like Facebook data was the right data. And so it's back here. So this first part is kind of a view into, is more an empirical part, kind of economic sociology. And then the second paper is more kind of a network science, or you could think of it as like game theory on graphs or kind of applied probability sort of thing. So, but I'm going to start with this first part. And so this is joint work with a number of folks then, and the first part in particular was really led by Iman Jahani. So the focus of the talk is on the role of network structure, and in particular thinking about long ties. And so what are long ties? What are weak ties? So strong ties are ones where there's maybe high time, high emotional intensity, a lot of reciprocal exchange happening between people, maybe a lot of trust, right? So these could be very close friends, family members, etc., right? And strong ties typically, not always, but typically are embedded in closed triads. It's a little unusual if you're best friend and you have no mutual friends, right? It's not impossible, but it's a little unusual, right? And so overall, so these ties that are the highest trust and intimacy, et cetera, are often embedded in these close ties. Weak ties, ones where there's less frequent interaction, maybe lower levels of trust, lower bandwidth in some sense, are more likely to be part of open triads. So it might be that I know somebody who I met some time ago, and I don't actually have really many common connections with them, right? And so that can actually be advantageous in terms of providing me access to information that's novel, right? If my network consists of just a bunch of people who all know each other, we kind of all have the same information set. So if I'm trying to find out about economic opportunities, Iyad maybe tells me about an interesting job opportunity, and then Ada tells me about an interesting job opportunity, and they're all the same job opportunity, right? Because you guys all have the same information set in some way, right? If we have this kind of complete graph among my neighbors. So there's this idea that goes back to Granovetter and Burt that structural diversity is defined as having an ego network with long ties, so that there's kind of multiple communities present in my network, that provides information advantages, right? That gives me access to a wider set of information. So this is kind of the idea that we're going to be exploring here and thinking about how does this question about network structure, presence of long ties, how does that matter for economic outcomes for people? And then we're going to think about that maybe, if we have time, a little bit more in a theoretical model, social contagion. And I guess I think my sense is this group thinks a lot about people interacting with computers and sort of a machine perspective on this. And a lot of my work is in some ways also closer to HCI and some of these topics as well. Here, in some ways, we're going to mainly use Facebook as a way of measuring people's networks, not necessarily thinking that all this information exchange is happening via Facebook. But I think it's interesting to maybe take a somewhat critical perspective on what we're going to do from the perspective of, well, this data is arising from a very particular socio-technical system. And so, anyway, I guess I'm already inviting some possible critiques here. Okay, so what we're gonna think about is, do disease, information, and behavior spread more rapidly through a network that looks like this? It's very clustered. There's a lot of triad closure, right? Or a network that looks more like this, right? And what local network structures for somebody in this network? Is it advantageous to be, say, in this position where you have a lot of redundancy versus in this position where you have this long tie instead, right? Instead of this redundant tie over here, right? And how do people end up with different network structures, right? So what sorts of events cause people to end up with having either a lot of closed triads around them or a lot of open triads, a lot of long ties? And then if we were to think about what kinds of interventions we might make to a network structure, which sorts of interventions would actually speed up or slow down the spread of different sorts of contagions. So that's what we're going to try to talk about a bit here. And so that's going to be kind of in there's sort of two main parts. One is looking at long ties in the United States and Mexico, and where are they? Like, who has more long ties? Where are they geographically? How are they associated with economic outcomes? What sorts of life events are then associated with having these long ties? And then, if we have time, some of the more theory part of this as well. So what the data that we're going to work with here is data from Facebook where people are exchanging comments. So I think always a choice when trying to think about how you do a social network analysis is what is the network actually, right? And so on Facebook, kind of the default network you might think about is the declared friendship network. But a lot of these edges are not really active in any way. So for a lot of this, we're going to use this commenting network. So an undirected edge is going to exist if users I and J have reciprocally exchanged comments during a 6-month period. Okay. And these qualifying comments are if Iyad posts something and I comment on his post, right? Or I post something and I actually mention Iyad in my post. And so this is sparser than the declared friendship network. And then we're going to also use this same measure of commenting as a measure of tie strength. Now, of course, this isn't going to be a perfect measure of tie strength. Sometimes maybe the people you're closest to, you don't need to interact with them on Facebook per se. Even in the US, where maybe people use Facebook more than, say, in Germany. And then we're going to be keeping track of where people live. So we're going to use a predicted zip code of residence for each person based on if they do self-report what their current residence is, but also information from their IP address, et cetera. So that's going to allow us to look at what individuals' network structures are and also to aggregate things regionally to look at what the network structures are in different zip codes. One of the advantages of looking at things at the aggregated geographic level is that this is going to allow us to link this to a lot of data about economic outcomes. Unless you're sort of one of the few people in, say, economics who has access to IRS data, like tax data in the US, you can analyze it in some basement, and you definitely can't merge it with the Facebook data. You need to rely on sort of aggregate information or other commercial information about people's economic outcomes. So for a lot of the analyses, we're going to be looking at aggregated regions. So for each region, for each zip code, we're going to think about the network for that zip code, where that consists of the people who are in the zip code. That's the blue nodes here. They have some network structure among them. They also have connections to people outside of that zip code. For this, we're defining long ties as these are ties without any mutual neighbors. And then we're going to compute what fraction of all the ties are long ties. For pretty much all the analyses, we're going to focus on only the out-region ties, that is the ties between people who live in a zip code and some other zip code. This is not a super consequential decision because the fraction of ties that go outside of a zip code is very high. Most people's connections are to somebody in a different zip code, given the size of connectedness of zip codes in the United States. But so the results don't really change whether you do that or not. But there are some issues of should you like double count some of the long ties that are in the region if you were going to include the in-region ties. So this allows us to say, what's fraction long ties for each zip code in the United States. And so then what does that measure look like? Here's a map. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Question. The data are for the US resident people, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And I'll show you a little bit with Mexico as well, but this is pretty much all just US residents. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then some of the later stuff will also be only US born people because we're kind of tracking their life events. Okay, so this is what this measure looks like in the US after parceling out controlling for average degree, because there's some of this can vary with just how many Facebook friends does somebody have, right? And then so we can kind of see that, some places like, say, the San Francisco Bay Area, and actually a bunch of Northern California, except for the Central Valley, has a relatively high degree of having long ties. Okay, you might look over, into this area, into Appalachia, right? And in Appalachia, which is a quite poor area of the United States, there's actually a relatively low number of long ties. So a kind of, ocular regression using information you might already know about the economic geography of the United States, you might say, it is sort of looking like long ties are possibly associated with economic outcomes, but we'll look at that more seriously. Here's a similar map for Mexico, which maybe is relevant if you have background knowledge to bring to bear onto Mexico. And the one difference is in Mexico, in some areas, we really don't have enough data to get a good estimate. So those areas are in white. But from people who know a little bit more about the economic geography of Mexico, some of this kind of makes sense as something that, looking at this starts to look correlated with economic outcomes, but we're going to dig into that. So we're going to now try to see how the presence of these long ties in these different places is associated with economic outcomes in those same places. Yep.
Mexico, the post, was it because the previous map was every pixel, I suppose, was the post zip code, right?
So
US.
Yeah, actually for this, we changed for the maps, it's at the county level, just because there's so many zip codes. So all the analysis is really going to be at the zip code level, which is smaller, but for the maps, they're more aggregated to a higher administrative unit.
And same holds for Mexico.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so we do the analysis at the zip code level, but here we're plotting it at this somewhat more aggregated level.
Approximately how many zip codes would there be in a county? 4 or 5? Say.
Yeah, it depends a lot, because actually you can kind of see in this map that some places for various reasons have very large counties and some of them have very small counties. So like a lot of Arizona's population is all in one county. Whereas in California, there's a lot more counties. So it kind of, there's not a great stable relationship there. Okay, so what we're going to do is look at how the economic outcomes in some county, in some zip code, Z, are associated with the fraction of long ties in that county to other areas, right? So our expectation is that if you have more of these long ties, maybe you have access to more advantageous information sets, and that can be good for various outcomes. We're going to do this with, and if you're not familiar with this tool, it's kind of a nice tool. It's this software bin scatter. It's going to allow us to estimate a pretty flexible function for how the outcome might depend on the fraction of long ties, so that we can estimate this non-parametrically while also controlling for a bunch of other characteristics. So we're going to control for population and race and the number of nodes, which is, these two are sort of related, but capture some things about Facebook penetration. So this is then what these results are going to look like, is that this is now just for the United States. Here's the fraction of out-region ties, out-zip code ties that are long edges, and then here's the mean household income. So as we look at counties that have a higher fraction of long ties, we have higher incomes. Now, a lot of my research is on causal inferences, as you mentioned. So it's not like now I'm declaring, okay, so all we need to do is, get people some more long ties. I don't know, how do we do that? Well, actually, I guess we could cause people to have sort of a falling out in their friend group, and then some ties become long, and then their household income will go up. Okay, obviously there's a more complex story here, and we'll think about what are some of the different causal interpretations of this. But really, in this work, we're kind of trying to provide this broad set of stylized facts about the association between network structure and economic outcomes. But I think there's potentially multiple causal pathways involved here. But just to show you that it's not just for this income measure, we see this fraction, if you look at the fraction of households that have income below some threshold, right, that's decreasing as you have a higher fraction of these long ties. Similarly, the unemployment rate is lower in these places with more long ties. I think historically, one of the things that's not always been super clear in this literature about network structure is people talk a lot about weak ties, right? So the classic Granovetter paper that I started with is called The Strength of Weak Ties. I think this came out now just about 50 years ago. 1973, it's not, 70s are not 30 years ago anymore. They're actually like 50 years ago. Okay, right? So, has tens of thousands of citations. And their Granovetter is actually pretty subtle about all this and talks about how often weak ties are ones that are not embedded in some ways. But our contention would really be that it's the length of the ties that's providing people access to novel information. It's the fact that I'm connected to this person and I don't have other contexts in common. That's what's helpful. And in fact, if I had a strong tie with somebody who is a long tie, I have a high bandwidth connection with somebody who I don't have other mutual contacts with, maybe that's actually even more advantageous because, for example, if they're telling me about job opportunities, et cetera, they may want to tell that only to the people that they trust the most as part of reciprocal exchange that happens in close relationships. Or if it's like complex information that they're communicating, right? We just communicate infrequently, then they might not be able to communicate more complex information to me. But if we interact a lot, then I might gain a lot more complex information. So our contention, and we're not the first to suggest this actually, my colleague and co-author Sinan Aral has some nice earlier work about this as well, is that it's really the length of the ties that matters. And we might actually expect that strong long ties are even more advantageous, okay? So we not only compute the fraction of long ties, but we compute a weighted fraction of long ties where we're weighting by the fraction of all interactions by some individual that are with this person, right? So that's going to pick up how much of their tie strength is allocated to long ties, okay?
And page rank? Sorry. Like a page rank measure?
This is all just at this one hop. So I think, it could be interesting to think about some broader centrality measures, and some of these things may be correlated with that. So this would just be at the individual level. Maybe you have 3 friends, and you've exchanged 1 comment with 2 of them, and 10 comments with another one of them, right? And the people, you could imagine some different configurations there, where either I guess, sorry, we haven't one in line. But right. So yeah. Okay, great. So this is this focal individual, right? And then you could imagine that they have these 3 friends, right? And they have interaction frequency 1, 1, and 10, right? And it could be that either these 2 people are also connected, right? In which case they're going to have a high weighted fraction of long ties, because what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, which of their ties are long? Only this one, right? And so we're going to say 10 divided by 12, right? And that's going to be their weighted fraction of long ties. On the other hand, if in fact there's an edge there, right, then we'd say, oh, actually they only have 1 out of 12 as their weighted fraction of long ties. So even with the same number of long ties, we might think that this could be more advantageous for them in terms of getting novel information, right? Especially you think about a case, say this is 5 and 5, right? That they now have the same total kind of bandwidth with 2 distinct communities in some sense. So that's sort of what that measure is designed to pick up. Yeah. So, and then we do the same analysis, but now we're also doing conditional on the fraction of long ties. So does this weighted version, this weighted measure of structural diversity of this weighted fraction of long ties, does it add anything further? And yes, it's also even conditional on just the fraction of long ties is associated with household income, okay? So it seems like it's not that what is important is that the ties are weak. On average, long ties are weak ties. It is difficult to sort of maintain you know, a lot of close relationships with people who don't know anyone else you know, right? It'd be like if you know, if you're visiting a city where a bunch of your friends live, but you can't have dinner with all of them at once because they don't know each other, right? It's more costly, right, in a lot of ways, and time, etc. So it's unsurprising that you know, long ties are weaker on average, but when you know, a bit more strength on these long ties seems to be associated with this kind of economic advantage. And a similar result applies for Mexico. In Mexico, we don't have as much economic outcome data. We have this kind of one measure that's less interpretable that comes from the Mexican government, but it seems like we have this kind of same association using the same sort of analysis. So that's sort of this like big stylized fact essentially that we have so far, which is that places with more long ties and stronger long ties have better economic outcomes, even after adjusting for other network characteristics. You know, so first, as I mentioned already, it's not clear that that there's a single causal direction here, right? And actually what I've said about costs of maintaining long ties already kind of gets at that, right? Like maybe one factor in being able to maintain strong long ties is wealth, that you go visit people who live in different places, because long ties in the sense of in the network may also be geographically long ties more often, right? And so maybe it's more costly to maintain those ties in some ways, right? So it could actually be that wealth helps people have networks that are have this structure. So there could be effects in both directions. And then also these are ecological regressions, right? We've aggregated things to the zip code level, and then we're correlating with economic outcomes at the zip code level. And so you might worry that there's this kind of ecological association. People who are in counties where people have more long ties maybe are wealthier, but is it their own long ties that matter? In some ways, I think actually that's fine, because we kind of would assume that there's some spillovers happening here, right? If I'm in a place where there's a bunch of people who are getting economic advantages from having long ties, some of that might spill over to me, even if I don't have the long ties themselves, right? I could be getting a job at an upscale restaurant instead of a downscale restaurant because some of the people in the same place that I live have economically advantageous connections, right? But, or it could be that I don't have a lot of long ties, right? But one of my friends has a lot of long ties. And so I'm somehow getting still somewhat more diverse, information as a result. Okay, but still, I think it's useful to look at individual level life events, network structures, and outcomes. And some of this is stuff that we've just added. I was just updating the slides to include this, so it's not in the online version of this paper yet. But we don't have, as I said, individual level income data, or at least not very good individual level income data. In the past, I've known people who've audited this kind of data where you buy estimates of people's income from two data providers. And I don't know whether this is worrying or encouraging that like people don't, these companies don't really know as much about us as they think they do. But one data broker says this person's income is 40,000, and another person, another data broker says it's 150,000, and there's a lot of noise and bias there. So we didn't try to do that, but instead we looked at a couple proxies for individual economic prosperity. One is the price of their mobile phone. Not necessarily for everyone, but on average, people who are wealthier may have more expensive mobile phones, and also the number of donations that they make to charitable fundraisers on Facebook, which suggests that maybe they have more disposable income in some way. Obviously, it's not necessarily the case that wealthier people are not always more charitable or more generous, but they may be more able to sort of make donations to these causes that come across their feed. And so we see across the 6 most populous states in the US, we run the same kind of analysis, but at the individual level, that we get this same kind of generally positive association between the fraction of long edges and mobile phone price or number of donations. We also do this with the zip code level household income. So then in this case, we have the outcome is at the aggregated level, but the the predictors are at the individual level.
Just a quick question.
Mhm.
What's going on with the negative price for mobile phones?
Yeah. So sorry, this is all after partialing out all the other things. So it's I think that we have pinned 0 to be like the 20th percentile or something like that of the fraction of long edges. So yeah, you can interpret this as this is this additive difference, but yeah, it's this is not the actual price of the mobile phones. Maybe it would be better for us to add back in that mean or something. But some of these are different between these states as well. So they're not really all on the same scale otherwise. Similarly, we can do that with the weighted fraction of long edges. And I say some of this is a little bit noisier, in particular with the mobile phone price. I guess this just died. But with the number of donations and the income, still seeing sort of a similar kind of pattern. So then I think one question is like, where do these ties come from? How do people end up with more long ties or not? And it's actually something that's been not so well studied in the literature. So kind of literature that this is most related to is a lot of work in sociology. And I'd say most of that literature prior to what we've done is kind of at the level of a firm, right? That a sociologist studies a bunch of salespeople working in a firm and says, okay, what network structures that those salespeople have are associated with success, right? And so part of what we've offered here is this much bigger population scale view of this association that spans multiple firms and all kinds of professions. But even in the firm setting, I think that often it's taken as given that some people are kind of more naturally brokers or more able to balance connecting with multiple different communities in the organization. But where does that come from? Some life events? Is that heritable? Well, okay, we're not going to unpack all the causes of that, but we thought it would be nice to look at a couple life events that we hypothesized would be associated with formation of long ties. So interstate migration, people who move between US states or born in one state and move to another state. And then college attendance, whether people attend an in-state college or an out-of-state college. And I'd say both of these things are potentially somewhat endogenous in that you might worry that like the type of people who choose to go to college out of state are somehow different in some way. And I think that's true. But so maybe my favorite is attending multiple high schools, people who switch high schools during, so high school would be, before going to university. And I think for international context, this should best be understood as university, people going to different universities. And so, somebody might go to two high schools because a parent moves. The parents move for some reason, and then they're going to a different high school. So it may not be the same kind of optimized situation. So I don't know. So here's interstate migrants. So post-stratifying, or adjusting for age, gender, hometown county income, migrants have 13% more long ties compared with non-migrants. This actually is true looking at migrants who have similar degrees, so have similar number of Facebook friends. So here we look at, for each of these degree bins, what's the long tie fraction for migrants and non-migrants? These are interstate migrants within the United States. So, at every level, these interstate migrants have more long ties. And interestingly, this is true even if you only look at their ties within their current state, right? So it's not just that, they have these ties from the previous state that they were living in, and those are sort of the long ties. It may be that this is consistent with the idea that they might be developing some sort of a disposition towards forming and maintaining long ties in that way. Similarly, we look at attending multiple high schools. So we're looking at people who attended high school a little while ago, right? These are people who are aged between 30 and 60 and who haven't been going between states. The high schools are in the same state. And so, as before, multiple high school attendees have 10% more long ties compared with those who attended a single high school. This is also true even if you look at just the ties that were neither of the high schools is in common. Okay, so I think this is sort of a nice like story about, wait, how might people end up not only with getting ties directly related to some event by attending multiple high schools, and maybe end up with a more structurally diverse network, but also this might be something that kind of cascades on into my life in the future beyond these high schools, is that I'm able to form or maintain these more structurally diverse ties.
Question.
Yeah.
Are there like diminishing marginal returns on additional high schools? Like, have you looked at the map world?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Yeah. No, I don't think we've looked at anyone who, and I think we label this as multiple, but I think this is actually all two. I would have to check that, but I believe it's actually all, that we only have the two case in here. And we have filtered this in various ways. Like sometimes people maybe are, like say they went to two different high schools on Facebook because there's like duplicates or something like that. We've actually matched the high schools against known real high schools in a database of high schools in the United States. And so we kind of filtered out some of those data quality issues. But yeah, I mean, that you might imagine has some other kind of endogeneity. When you're on your fourth high school, what's going on here? Interesting. But yeah, I think, issues related to the profile are kind of a potential confounder here. So you might think that people who, report multiple high schools are just good at filling out their profiles on Facebook, right? They just really like providing lots of information to Facebook, right? So we do some analysis where we stratify by the number of completed profile fields. So we say, how many of these have they filled out on their profile? Relationship status, current city, employer, and mobile number. And the idea would be that kind of captures their proclivity to just like fill out things on Facebook, okay? And so, as we change the number of disclosed fields, you see that basically the fraction of long ties among single high school attendees is always lower than that under multiple high school attendees. So even sort of an over adjustment where you would try to compare, people who fill out all four of the fields but went to a single high school, they actually have fewer long ties than the multiple high school people who don't fill out any of these other fields, right? So that suggests that maybe that's not all that is driving that there. Cool. So I'd say, this provides sort of most of the view here. So far, long ties are associated with economic prosperity at the individual level and at this regional level. We have some evidence that life events could help create more long ties, both directly and in this kind of, to be determined indirect way. So that's sort of the empirical part of what I was going to present today, that I'd say is, in some sense meant to be this very kind of high level view of association between network structure and what happens economically. So I'm seeing that we're about 40 minutes in. Happy to take some questions about this. I can also talk to some varying degree about the sort of some of the theory as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I just have one question. So I was thinking about the fact that if I have a strong long tie, why wouldn't I connect this strong long tie with others? And I was thinking whether you could speak with your data to anything related to, for example, political diversity, right? So maybe it's a friend that I would feel uncomfortable introducing to some ways.
Yeah.
There or any other marker of like being more distant from my usual network of friends.
Yeah.
Is there anything like that you can?
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion, especially to look at that in that sort of differentiated way. Part of how we've thought about that a little bit is that would be a big advantage of looking at this more dynamic over time, right? And actually, when I gave this talk at Stanford in March, Mark Granovetter actually tuned in. Yeah, he was. I realized he was, one of the hybrid. It was a hybrid talk, so he was one of the online attendees, and he had something very similar. One of the things that often happens when you form a weak tie, and then maybe it gets stronger, is that that person might sort of pull you into the setting that they're in, right? Both through explicit efforts to introduce you, but also if you think about some of these economic opportunities, it'd be like, oh, okay, we get connected and then you come work with me. Oh, well, and then it's not that I'm like going out of my way to introduce you to people, just now we're going to have the same employer. And so you're going to be connected to a lot of people. And now if we look at a snapshot of the network, you know, a year later, now this is no longer a long time. So I think there is a lot that's missed by this kind of static snapshot view of this. And I think if I was going to kind of, you know, think about what could be, you know, what we could further do here, it would be to really think about the dynamics of the network. Yeah, one of the challenges that some of these life events we're trying to study here are things that happened a while ago, like, and so they were not contemporaneously captured on Facebook, right? Somebody who's 50 years old, high school, you know, Facebook didn't exist when they were in high school, right? Yeah. Do
you have any information about people's activity on there in US?
No, but that's interesting. Yeah. What do you think?
I can see this being one of the opportunities where you actually get into contact with someone that's sort of outside of any other sort of context, and then you sort of each go your way and you keep that connection, and there will not be really this opportunity to introduce yourself to.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, or sort of similar kinds of things like couch surfing, et cetera, where people sometimes form these connections that last for a while. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's a direction where one approach can be to try to augment some of this data with smaller survey data, which is something Facebook has sometimes done in the past of asking, you know, doing surveys where they ask people, wait, how do you know this person? You know, ask questions that validate some of these measures of size strength, which in the past has worked out well. But you could go also into that, like, wait, how did you meet this person? Yeah.
Okay, question, like, I know you're very interested in causal inference, and is there any chance you could make some causal claims about this association?
Yeah. So yeah, we've thought about that a little bit, and I'd say one of the promising directions would be this closest to what we've done is things that cause these life events that maybe are exogenous, right? And so things that affect whether there's a new high school that opens or whether two high schools merge, these kinds of things could affect how many high schools people attend. And I think those are nice and that it's a somewhat well-defined intervention. One of the things in causal inference is usually is like kind of a good, like, heuristic is like, what is the ideal randomized experiment that I would run here, right? And when you ask the question just about how does network structure affect outcomes, I think that's kind of a big question. And it's not that it's an ill-defined question, but it's good to think really concretely about what are the interventions we have in mind. Sort of like what I alluded to earlier of, okay, the intervention where we give you more long ties is not where we like make some of your friends who have mutual friends, you know, like have a falling out. Like that doesn't seem like that's what we're considering. What are we considering? Maybe we're considering something like where you happen to meet somebody and either they happen to be connected to somebody that you already knew or not, right? It could be that you start working with someone and just by chance they could know somebody who you know, right? Or not. And that might be the kind of contrast that I think would be nice. The thing that we've gotten closest to doing is basically looking at changes, things that affect college and high school attendance. So there's other stuff around like reciprocal in-state tuition agreements between US states. Universities really can be very expensive in the United States, even public universities, especially if you go to one that's not in your US state. But then some states have reciprocal agreements with each other so that, oh, you can go to University of Nevada, Reno, even if you live in California and pay an in-state tuition and there's some reciprocal agreement in the other direction. So when did these reciprocal agreements come into play? right? And that could be a way of getting at some of that. So we've thought of doing some of that. I think that's beyond the current scope of this project, which we're trying to, be done with in some way. But that's one way I would think about doing.
I was wondering what's the fraction of the members who has the long ties and short ties? Is it clear?
Yeah. So I think a large fraction of Facebook users have at least one long tie by this definition, but it's not. So like, to get a sense of, okay, what's a typical fraction, right? Is it here we see, okay, typical fraction is around a third, right? But what's the fraction of people who have at least one? I'm not sure, but that's a good question. I mean, I think you also, if you say look at this. Oh, we don't have that one in here. Sorry. There's a lot of variation in what people's degree is as well in the network. And so, what's the mean degree in a zip code in this commenting network? And so whether you have a long tie or not is pretty associated with your degree, which is one of the reasons why we control for degree. And in a lot of these analyses, right, we want to think about what's the incremental contribution of thinking about the network structure beyond just degree. So, so that didn't really directly answer your question, but I'd say like maybe about a third is a good kind of rule of thumb here. Yeah. Yeah.
You have a question like fascinating talk. Like, do you think it would be possible with your data to assign some kind of economic value to ties? I mean, at the moment you kind of look at the node level, right? And calculate one value for the node and then make these relationships with like I think it would be fascinating if you have like the economic value of a tie, because then you can more like what's driving this, and you can maybe disentangle, so like, I don't know, school ties or like what kind of ties are driving actually the economic value. Yeah. And so, I mean, maybe, so there's like maybe the economic value of the incremental tie at all, just like what's the effect of taking your degree from 40 to 41? And then it could be, okay, given that you're going from 40 to 41, what's the effect of a strong tie versus a weak tie? I'd say, I think we in some way have avoided some of those analyses here because also we don't want to, we're kind of trying to be, provide this sort of set of stylized facts about this association without really trying to say, oh, you change network structure like this and you get this economic benefit. But we have another project that there's not a working paper online yet but they look specifically at people's success in fundraising on Facebook. So, we already use that as a proxy here, was more like, how much am I giving to other people's campaigns, right? But another thing you can do on Facebook is Facebook will suggest when your birthday is coming up, why don't you have a fundraiser for a charity of your choice and encourage your friends to donate to that charity for your birthday. So how much money do you end up raising for the charity? How many unique people donate? And so we look at that as an outcome, and then we're in that setting able to look at people's network structure and really think about, okay, what happens if you have the same degree and one additional long tie or short tie? And we find some results that are kind of similar to this picture. That's another way that also we're really exploring kind of a direct causal inference here, is to think about as good as random variation in which parts of your network are activated at a given time. So we think like what network structure you have is kind of confounded and determined by a whole bunch of different things, right? But it might be that on the day that you launch your Facebook campaign, your fundraising campaign, that perhaps some of your friends just don't happen to log into Facebook that day, right? Given their whole history of how frequently they log into Facebook, right? But like some days they happen to log in, some days they don't. And it could be that your long ties log in or your short ties log in or something like that, right? And so we try to use that random variation in who logs in. So you can think of it as that you have network, and then there's some like random subset of the nodes that are active, right? And then we can kind of think about that as a source of randomness, and then maybe think about the incremental effect of each tie on your fundraising success. But it's not then on your total income or something like that, which maybe is a little bit more difficult. I mean, I think to some degree something like that, to the extent that you kind of want to have a kind of single directional monocausal kind of interpretation of this is, something about this kind of slope here, right? So, okay, if you go from having 20% of your ties be long ties to 30%, okay, you go from 35K to 55K household income as the typical income in zip codes that have those different degrees of long ties. So is that kind of what you were thinking about? I don't know. I just sort of give a long answer.
I'm just wondering if you kind of put in a way. Yeah, I think it's the point, right? Like when you have the mobile price kind of.
Yeah.
Then you have on the individual node, you have you can have some variance in income and you can kind of see, okay, like on average, maybe you see that people who have a tie with someone from high school, a long tie from someone in high school, it's like seems to be kind of associated with an increased food. So if you go to the individual tie, then you could be more kind of also understand which properties of the tie, and not like just general fractions of norm, and you can say, okay, because in the end, it's like, I think the income is driven by individual events, right? It's not that you have like 50 long ties and this is making you like kind of a better economic outcome. It's like this one single tie, which is giving you the job, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually an interesting question, and maybe is a thing to think about. You asked about diminishing returns and related to that, it may be that certain areas have more diminishing returns than others. So if it's like, for a lot of jobs, it may be that, okay, once I have one job, not much else matters. Now, maybe it's useful as I'm trying to get a job that I could have multiple job offers at the same time. I have more negotiating power, right? So it could be there's some return from having multiple jobs. Then for some types of jobs, it may be that there's even way less diminishing returns because I leverage my network as part of my professional life a lot of the time, right? So it may be that if I'm a salesperson, right, that like having a really large network and a network with a lot of long ties gives me the ability to sort of have connections to many different sets of people, and I'm able to sell more, and I get commissions on my sales, and that affects my income. So I'm just sort of like thinking about this on kind of on the fly about what are those diminishing returns like. I think also looking, one of the challenges is we don't again know exactly how some of these ties formed, right? We might be able to say on average, right? Like, oh, people who went to multiple high schools, they have more ties, and we can look at, okay, do you both list the same high school? But we don't have a lot of detailed information about how ties necessarily actually form. I mean, as maybe we all have experienced, sometimes you meet somebody through one context and then you discover that you actually have another context in common, but you met through some other way. But I think that would be a nice thing to have more signal on. So
just kind of a technical question about working with Facebook data.
Yeah.
Are you able to, for example, do content analysis on conversations between people and what they were saying to each other to kind of, make inferences about how their ties can form?
Yeah.
Hey, it was nice to meet you last night at the party or something like this. I'm just wondering, like dreaming about, is it possible to, in the limit, extract this kind of information from the data?
Yeah, that's interesting. Where I might think that would be even more prevalent would perhaps be on LinkedIn, where LinkedIn really encourages you to kind of, potentially edit a message that's your like connection invitation message. Facebook doesn't do that quite so much. So, but yeah, that could be an interesting possibility. Yeah.
Kind of like policy against against it, right? Like as long as the algorithm is the one doing the analysis, not you.
Yeah.
Reading.
I don't know the current state of all the policy things, I mean, in terms of that would be, I guess, the private one-to-one messaging. Which there are sort of additional considerations about using that data. Historically, Facebook has done and has published research that has involved aggregated analysis of that messaging data. But I don't know where they are on that currently. Because I think, there's been I don't really have any inside information on this, but, there's been an interest in introducing end-to-end encryption into Facebook Messenger in addition to WhatsApp, which already has end-to-end encryption, in which case that actually just becomes impossible. And sort of you might think that, generally that's a direction that things are going. So, but yeah, I think that's an interesting, an interesting thought about how you might,
Do you have any data on the lifetime of these long ties, or?
Yeah, like when they formed. Yeah, we do, and we
And what
yeah.
is bullshit? Let's say
Yeah.
the lifetime of these ties compared to other sorts of active ties, which are much closer to.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's this paper by Eaman Jahani and Sandy Pentland and some other people that looks at persistence of long ties, and I think they actually find some surprising things about these long ties maybe being more persistent than these short ties, but it's in a somewhat different context. I mean, it's all sort of, I think, depends a little bit on how you define the network. And I think there's complicated things there. I mean, it's interesting to think about, okay, how do you define when the tie is active? For us, it's like we pick this 6-month period, we look at people exchanging comments, right? One of the things you might expect is that with short ties, sometimes because of the redundancy, you don't actually communicate directly with all of the people, right? So if we're friends and, I also introduce you to my spouse, so you might have a Facebook tie with my spouse, but it might be that, when it comes time to arrange for us to have dinner or something like that we're communicating directly, right? And that you don't have that many communications with, her directly, right? Or just that if you're trying to keep up with a group of friends who stayed in your hometown, there might be one of them that you communicate more with than the rest, but they sort of update you about various things, right? And so just actually precisely through the nature of the long versus short ties, I think there are some questions about how how fundamentally what we're measuring in terms of the tie strength can vary in that way. And I'd say that's somewhat of a criticism of our own measurement here, right? We don't actually measure something like intimacy or trust, right? We don't ask people, how much money would you loan this person, right? Which is a classic kind of tie strength question, right? We instead have this kind of not available bandwidth, but sort of realized bandwidth. How much have you actually exchanged messages, right? But it might be there's really high bandwidth there, but it's not always used because in fact there's other channels that are available. Cool. Well, I think we're out of time, and obviously there's a lot more I could have talked about, but I just say I focused on this first paper, Origins and Consequences of Long Ties in Social Networks. If you really prefer some applied probability, there's the second paper, and really happy to be kind of beginning a conversation with all of you, particularly while I'm in town.